Signs of the Times, Chapter 81, January 23, 1879. The Great Controversy Between Christ and His Angels and Satan and His Angels. Chapter 3, concluded. The Temptation and Fall by Mrs. E.G. White. Adam quite well understood that his companion had transgressed the only prohibition laid upon them as a test of their fidelity and love. Eve reasoned that the serpent said they should not surely die, and his words must be true, for she felt no signs of God's displeasure, but a pleasant influence, as she imagined the angels felt. Adam regretted that Eve had left his side, but now the deed was done. He must be separated from her, whose society he had loved so well. How could he have it thus? His love for Eve was strong, and in utter discouragement he resolved to share her fate. He reasoned that Eve was a part of himself, and if she must die, he would die with her, for he could not bear the thought of separation from her. He did not think that God, who had created him a living, beautiful form out of the dust of the ground, and had given him Eve to be his companion, could supply her place. After all, might not the words of this wise serpent be correct? Eve was before him just as lovely and beautiful, and apparently as innocent as before this act of disobedience. She expressed greater, higher love for him than before her disobedience, and the effect of the fruit she had eaten. He saw in her no signs of death. She had told him of the happy influence of the fruit, of her ardent love for him, and he decided to brave the consequences. He seized the fruit and quickly ate it, and like Eve, felt not immediately ill effects. Signs of the Time, Signs of the Time, January 23rd, 1879, paragraph 1. Eve had thought herself capable of deciding between right and wrong. The flattering hope of entering a high state of knowledge had led her to think that the serpent was her especial friend, possessing a great interest in her welfare. If she had sought her husband, and they had related their maker the words of the serpent, they would have been delivered at once from his artful temptation. God instructed our first parents in regard to the tree of knowledge, and they were fully informed relative to the fall of Satan and the danger of listening to his suggestions. God did not deprive them of the power of eating the forbidden fruit. He left them as free moral agents to believe his word, obey his command, and live or believe the temper, disobey and perish. They both ate, and the great wisdom they obtained was the knowledge of sin and a sense of guilt. The Lord would not have them investigate the fruit of the tree of knowledge, for then they would be exposed to Satan's mask. He knew that they would be perfectly safe if they touch not the fruit. Our first parents chose to believe the words as they thought of a serpent, yet he had given them no token of his love. He had done nothing for their happiness and benefit, while God had given them everything that was good for food and pleasant to sight. Everywhere the eye might rest was abundance and beauty. Yet Eve was deceived by the serpent to think that there was something withheld which would make them wise, even as God. Instead of believing and confiding in their Creator, she basely distrusted his goodness and cherished the words of Satan. After Adam's transgression, he at first imagined himself rising to a new and higher existence. But soon the thought of his transgression terrified him. The air that had been of mild and even temperature seemed chilled. The guilty pair, they had a sense of sin and felt the dread of the future, a sense of want, a nakedness of soul. The sweet love and peace seemed removed from them, and in their place, a want of something came over them that they had never experienced before. They then For the first time, they then for the first turned their attention to the external. They had not been clothed, but were draped in light, as were the heavenly angels. This light which had enshrouded them departed to relieve the sense of nakedness which they realized. Their attention was directed to seek a covering for their forms, for they could, for how could they meet the eye of God and angels unclothed? Their crime is not is now before them in its true light. Their transgression of God's express command assumed a clearer character. Adam censored Eve's folly in leaving his side and being deceived by the serpent, but they both flattered themselves that God, who had given them everything to make them happy, might yet excuse their disobedience because of his great love to them, and that their punishment would not be so dreadful after all. Satan exalted in his success. He had tempted the woman to distrust God, to question his wisdom, and to seek to penetrate his all wise plan. And through her, he had also caused the overthrow of Adam, who, in consequence of his love for Eve, disobeyed the command of God and fell with her. The news of man's fall spread through heaven. Every harp was hushed. The angels cast their crowns from their head in sorrow. All heaven was in agitation. The angels were grieved at the base ingratitude of man in return for the rich blessings which God had bestowed upon him. A council was held to see what must be done with the guilty pair. The angel feared that they would put forth the hand and eat of the tree of life, and thus perpetuate a life of sin. The Lord visited Adam and Eve and made known to them the consequences of their disobedience. And as they hear God's majestic approach, they seek to hide themselves from inspection of him who they delighted, while in their innocence and holiness to meet. And the Lord God called unto Adam and said unto him, Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, Who told thee that thou was naked? Thou hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shouldest not eat? This question was asked by the Lord, not because he needed information, but for the conviction of the guilty pair. Adam acknowledged his transgression not because he was penitent for his great disobedience, but to cast reflection upon God. The woman whom thou gavest to me to be with me, she gave of me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat. The woman was then addressed. What is this that thou hast done? Eve answered, The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. The Lord then addressed the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And the serpent had been exalted above the beasts of the field. He should be degraded beneath them all and be detested by man, inasmuch as he was the medium through which Satan attacked. And unto Adam, and he said, Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and thou hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cause cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. God cursed the ground because of the sin of Adam and Eve in eating of the tree of knowledge, and declared, In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. He had apportioned them the good, but it withheld the evil. Now he declares that they shall eat of it, that is, they shall be acquainted with evil all the days of their life. The race from that time forward was to be afflicted by Satan's temptations. A life of perpetual toil and anxiety was appointed unto Adam, instead of the happy, cheerful labor which he had hitherto enjoyed. They should be subjected to disobedience, grief, and pain, and finally come to dissolution. They were made of the dust of the earth, and unto the dust should they return. Adam and Eve were informed that they must lose their Eden home. They had yielded to Satan's deception and believed that God would lie. By their transgression, they had opened a way for Satan to gain access to them more readily, and it was not safe for them to remain in the Garden of Eden, lest in their state of sin, they gain access to the tree of life and perpetuate a life of sin. They entreated to, they entreated to be permitted to remain, although they acknowledged that they had forfeited all right to blissful Eden. They promised that they would in the future yield implicit obedience to God. They were informed that in their fall from innocence to guilt, they had gained no strength but great weakness. They had not preserved their integrity while they were in a state of holiness, happy innocence, and they would have far less strength to remain true and loyal in a state of conscious guilt. At these words, the unhappy pair were filled with keenness, anguish, and remorse. They now realized that the penalty of sin was death. It was Satan's studied plan that Adam and Eve should disobey God, receive his throne, and then partake of the tree of life, that they might perpetuate a life of sin. But holy angels were immediately commissioned to guard the way to the tree of life. Around these angels flashed beams of light on every side, which had the appearance of glittering swords. Many regard the punishment of Adam's transgression as too severe a penalty for so small a sin. The enemy of all righteousness has blinded the eyes of sinners so that sin does not appear sinful. Their standard of their standard of what constitutes sin is vastly different from God's standard. So those who regard Adam's sin as a matter of a very small consequence look a little deeper. They would see the great mercy of God in giving Adam the smallest possible test. It could scarcely be called a self-denial on his part to refrain from partaking of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, for he already had everything necessary to supply his wants. A compassionate God give no severe test, no strong temptation that would task human endurance beyond the power to resist. The fruit itself was harmless. If God had not forbidden Adam and Eve to partake of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, their action in taking it would not have been sinful. Up to the moment of God's prohibition, Adam might have eaten of the fruit of the tree without realizing any harm. But after God had said, "Thou shalt not eat," the act became a crime of great magnitude. Adam had disobeyed God, and this was his sin. The very fact that Adam's trial was small made his sin exceeding great. God tested him in that which was least to prove him, and with the prohibition, he stated that the punishment consequent upon his disobedience would be death. If Adam could not bear this small of a test to prove his loyalty, he surely could not have endured a stronger trial had he been taken into closer relationship with God to bear higher responsibilities. He evidenced that God could not trust him. Should he be exposed to Satan's more determined attacks, he would signally fail. God created man in his own image, after his likeness, free from sin, and with organs well developed. The earth was to be populated with intelligent beings who were only a little lower than the angels. But God would first prove the holy pair and test their obedience, for he could not have a world filled with beings who would disregard his laws. Adam did the worst thing he could do under the circumstances. In doing that which God had expressly forbidden, he set his will against the will of God, thus waging war with his requirements. The pen of inspiration has with accuracy traced the history of our first parents, sin and fall, that all generation may be one not to follow Adam's example in the slightest disregard of God's requirement, had the test been in regard to larger matters. Men might have excused the sin of disobedience in what they call smaller things. God made the test with Adam upon things that are least to show man that the slightest disobedience to his requirements is sin in every sense of the word. God, the government of the universe, has made all things subject to law. Things apparently insignificant and things of the greatest magnitude are all governed by laws adapted to their natures. Nothing that God has made had been forgotten or left to blind chance. To man, as being endowed with reasoning, powers, and conscience, God's moral law is given to control his actions. Man is not compelled to obey. He may defy God's law, as did Adam, and take the fearful consequences, or by living harmony with the law, he may reap the rewards of obedience. Ministers of our time give from their pulpits license to sin in saying to the sinner that the law of God is not binding upon man and that it is impossible for him to keep it. It was then impossible for Adam to keep God's law. And why should the punishment of transgression have fallen upon him? The very fact that disobedience to God in one of the smallest requirements brought such woe to our world shows that any disregard of his law will surely be followed by the penalty, which is death. Ministers who make war upon the law of God are gathering in their garments the blood of souls. They are walking in harmony with the great rebel.